Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. In this specific episode, we'll be talking about Love and Monsters, a 2020 film, and we'll be talking about some of the biological concepts that are discussed in the movie, not explicitly discussed, of course, but those that are touched on by particular elements, but specifically focusing on, of course, the monsters. And given what happened to, or what the source of the monsters in this particular movie is, then we're going to give special focus on mutations. The recording of this episode is also quite timely. I'm recording this on November 3, which is the anniversary of the first ever appearance of Godzilla. On this day in 1954, the original Gojira movie was released in Japan, marking the first ever appearance of our beloved King of Kaijus. So let's start first with a short introduction of the film by way of explaining the basic premise, which is that at a certain time in Earth, not very far from where we are right now, the Earth is threatened by an asteroid, which we are assuming will be a killer, a planet killer event, or something that will wipe out all life on Earth because the governments of the world take pains to destroy the asteroid with missiles and nuclear weapons, probably, and all sorts of things that are meant to defend the planet against such heavenly bodies striking the Earth. However, what happens is that chemicals, unidentified chemicals from the asteroid, fall onto the Earth and mutate cold-blooded animals. Specifically, the movie mentions insects, amphibians, and certain other organisms like arthropods. Basically, the creepy crawlies that a lot of people don't like. And the movie is set 7 years after this event, where 95%, if I'm not mistaken, of humans have been wiped out, and the few remaining humans are isolating themselves or hidden in panic rooms and bunkers and caves and whatever other shelter they can find that would protect them from the roaming giant cold-blooded animals, and that is primarily what their mutation has caused: gigantism, or a greater than average, much greater than average size, among others. So that's the basic premise. Now let's talk about the interesting things that touch on the biology. First and foremost, really, it's the mutation. These organisms have been mutated by whatever chemicals are in the asteroid. Now, of course, there's no explanation whatsoever about why it's the cold-blooded animals only that were targeted and not, or affected, I should say, and not any of the warm-blooded animals. And we'd see this. There's an example of fish being mutated. Of course, there are multiple examples of insects and worms or worm-like animals that are also mutated, as well as arthropods, other arthropods, and amphibians, which are also cold-blooded. I think there are also some indications that even reptiles, which are also cold-blooded, have been similarly affected by this chemical fallout from the asteroid. If we're to think about any possible reason at all as to why only cold-blooded animals were affected, it would probably have to do with the metabolism and the internal temperature of the animal. Really, the primary thing that distinguishes warm-blooded from cold-blooded animals is that warm-blooded animals are able to use their metabolism, which is basically breaking down the food that they eat, to be able to generate warmth inside their body, and so they're able to generate internal heat without their bodies having to conform to the external environment. On the other hand, cold-blooded animals like fish, amphibians, reptiles, and many other non-vertebrates are those whose body temperature match the ambient or the surrounding temperature because they cannot regulate their own internal heat through metabolism. And so these chemicals, if they affected only cold-blooded animals, probably were activated by the fact that the metabolism of the cold-blooded animals was not as high or not as effective, and so it probably has to do with the internal body temperature and physiological mechanisms that are unique to cold-blooded animals. It's very difficult right now to think of what those mechanisms could be. We'd have to stretch our imagination to be able to come up with that. But that's what the movie says. It's only cold-blooded animals that are affected. Now, in terms of the effect, there are two primary manifestations that are obvious in virtually all of the animals that were shown to be roaming the earth at this time. As I had mentioned, one is gigantism, a much larger than the normal size. These are giants, these are kaijus essentially, that have taken over not only Japan but all over the world. And the other one is monstrous mutated extra appendages. Okay? Sometimes extra appendages, sometimes just mutated or enhanced appendages. The giant toad that comes out of the swimming pool, I suppose that was a swimming pool, in one scene, is shown to have multiple eye stalks. Whereas, of course, we know that normal frogs, normal amphibians have only 2 eyes and they're not on stalks. So this is an aberration, a distinct mutation. So I'd like to focus on these two things because they are both explained by mutations. Gigantism is not unusual. There are a lot of animals that have shown gigantism, particularly in isolated places like islands and the deep ocean and very cold areas. We call the first one island gigantism, the second one deep sea gigantism, the third one, I think it's called polar gigantism. I'm not sure about that one. But essentially, when the environment is very unique and the animals tend to be isolated, as with islands, for example, and even with the deep sea, because it's a very, novel type of environment, then the set of environmental conditions could lead to giant versions of animals that we would find elsewhere in much smaller sizes. And this has to do with ecological rules, like for example, there not being too many natural predators that would, or competitors that would limit the body size of organisms. However, what's important to remember is that there are still limitations to the body size that an animal can get. Before we go into that, it's important to mention that mutations that would lead to gigantic versions of animals would have to do mostly with glands and growth hormones. For example, the thyroid gland is one very important gland in our body that produces thyroxine and other growth hormones that would determine the size that we achieve at a certain point in our lives. Those that are much larger than average would have certain modifications in their growth hormones or even in particular genes that have been implicated in the growth. Gigantism is a medical condition, usually thyroid associated in humans, but in other animals, the same could be said, which is that it's glandular. And any mutation is probably due to mutations in these glands and their products, meaning the excessive amount of growth hormones, for example. Now, I had mentioned earlier that it's not as simple as mutations happening and then the animal becoming very large over time. There are biophysical limitations to the size that an animal or any organism for that matter can achieve. And one of the primary principles in biology that puts this biophysical limitation on the size of animals is the relationship between surface area and volume. These are two properties of size of an animal or of the dimension of an animal. Let me talk briefly about it. As an organism grows in size, meaning its linear dimensions like its length and width increase, so will its surface area and volume, definitely. Obviously, an elephant would have a larger surface area than a mouse, and it would also have a larger volume compared to a mouse. Surface area is the amount of area covered by, the external surface of the animal, whereas the volume is essentially the space inside it that's filled with organs. You would remember that the formula for surface area is the area of one side or one face of the animal times the number of such sides. So for example, if you're talking about a cube-shaped organism, then the surface area is the area of one side which of course is length times width, so or length squared, given that the one linear dimension is equal to the other, multiplied by 6, which is the number of sides. Whereas volume is length times width times height, typically for an organism with such dimensions. Now, it's important to take note that as the organism grows in size and the surface area and volume both increase, these two properties do not increase at the same rate. Surface area grows by the square of a linear dimension increase, whereas volume grows by the cube, not the square. So, as an organism is growing in size, volume is outstripping surface area because it grows at a much faster rate than surface area does. So in essence, that is what we are saying is the biophysical limitation. If an organism grows too large, it will not have enough surface area to accommodate its very large volume. Aside from that, there are two other properties that scale with size, and these are mass and the weight-bearing strength of an animal. Weight-bearing strength, meaning the strength that we have to carry our own mass. Now, just like surface area, our weight-bearing strength grows only by the square of our linear dimension, whereas our mass grows by the cube. So that essentially means that an organism that is too large will be too heavy for it to carry itself. And that is particularly true for an animal that has a skeletal system, because the heavier an animal becomes, the more of its weight is due to skeletal weight. And we know that bone, for instance, which is not the only type of skeleton that there is. Certain animals have cartilage, which is much lighter. But a lot more animals have bone, and bone is a very, very dense, very, very heavy substance. So an animal as large as Godzilla is not feasible if its skeletal system were made of bone, like its fellow reptiles, because bone would be making up, say, around probably 95 to 98% of its body weight, and it would be too heavy, and so Godzilla wouldn't be able to carry itself or its own weight. And so its skeletal system would probably have to be something much lighter, like carbon nanotubes or something like that. So given these two things, the surface area to volume relationship and the relationship between mass-bearing strength and mass, it's very impractical for typically small animals to become overly large or much, much larger than they already are. Let's give a certain examples, the monsters or some of the monsters that were shown in the movie. So let's go back to that giant frog. The thing about frogs is that they undergo what is called cutaneous respiration, which is respiring through the skin. They breathe through the skin. Now, of course, they're not entirely dependent on this. Frogs have lungs, as you probably know if you've ever dissected a frog in biology class. So they use these lungs for respiration. However, when they're in the water, they undergo cutaneous respiration. Lungs are useless in water, they will shut down. So all of the breathing will be through the skin. Now, let's go back to the surface area to volume relationship that we had mentioned. The breathing of a frog via cutaneous respiration is done through the skin. So, of course, the larger the surface area of the skin of a frog, the better for it in terms of cutaneous respiration. However, what you have to remember is that what you are supplying with oxygen through cutaneous respiration are the internal organs, the volume. So even if the frog's surface area is large, if its volume is so large, then there will not be enough gases passing through the skin at any given time to be able to supply all of those organs with oxygen. And that becomes the problem with an overly large frog. Its volume will have outstripped its surface area by a lot at that point of that size, and so there will not be enough oxygen in the water to accommodate its volume. And the same could be said actually of its lungs, unless its lungs were gigantic, but then you'd also have to think of how many air sacs are in the lungs of the frog. It's the same problem for the giant insects actually, because giant insects or insects in general rely on a particular set of holes on their body called spiracles. This is how they breathe. These spiracles are holes through which air enters, and then the air travels through what are called tracheal tubes, which bring the gases directly to the body tissues. It's a direct contact or transportation to the body tissues. Now, the number of spiracles of an insect's body will be determined by its surface area. So a large insect will have more spiracles. However, the volume will be so large because of the surface area to volume relationship that there will not be enough spiracles and tracheal tubes to supply the body tissues of the insect with oxygen. And that becomes the problem. Add to that the weight of the animal, particularly insects, because they have an exoskeleton that's quite heavy. And so very large insects will have that problem. Now, you may know, if you've ever taken biology class before, that insects used to be much larger. There were times in the Earth's history when you'd see dragonflies this large or even larger. And that's in part because there was a lot more oxygen at the time. So even if the volume of such insects was larger than its surface area, relatively speaking, there was enough oxygen to go around. But given the amount of oxygen that we have here nowadays, then that would be very, very problematic for the insects. Now, there's another monster shown, which is the giant crab. And this is a type of animal called a crustacean, which is a group within the arthropod group that includes lobsters, crabs, shrimps, crayfish, barnacles, and some other heavily armored organisms. You know what I mean. You just need to look at the crab and see its carapace, which is its armor made of calcium carbonate and or chitin. And these crustaceans usually molt this armor. And so if these organisms were to grow to the large sizes that are depicted in the movie, they'd have to undergo molting several times. And that is very energetically costly. Also, at a certain moment, when they are shellless, when they've molted their armor, they will be very defenseless. And it's hard to imagine a very large arthropod that has lost its shell through molting, and it's very, very fragile. It will be easy picking for a lot of fellow giant arthropods in the wild. And so, on top of the energetic costs of molting repeatedly, it's something else that would provide a biophysical limitation to the size of such organisms. Now, the second major mutation that I want to talk about is the mutation of appendages into freaky extensions and extra appendages like the eye stalks on the frog. Now, there are mutations on real-life animals that have to do with such bizarre, aberrant forms. And these are what we call homeotic mutations. You may have heard of the Hox genes. The Hox genes are responsible for a lot of different things like our symmetry, the arrangement of our body parts, and the growth of the normal development of our appendages. There's a very interesting mutation, for example, in fruit flies called the Antennapedia mutation, where instead of growing antennae on their heads as normal, they grow an extra pair of legs. And as you can imagine, this is not beneficial for the animal at all, because it is not able to sense the environment as well as it should, having lost antennae, and it is undoubtedly unattractive to fellow fruit flies because of that aberrant appearance. In fact, most homeotic mutations are lethal. And so we're not saying that it's impossible for animals to benefit from homeotic mutations, but it's not very likely for animals to live for a very long time, much less be able to survive long enough to pass on these mutations to the next generation, because they are often lethal. Extra eyes, you would think, would be beneficial, but they are very energetically costly. And so the animal would have to eat much more. And they are also extra appendages that can be cut off, be sources of injury, or be eaten by potential predators. So it doesn't really pay to have a lot of homeotic mutations, even if there's a short-term benefit to them. Now, in the movie, it's shown very clearly that over the 7 years since the time of mutation to the setting of the movie, there have been reproductive events where these mutated animals have produced offspring. We can see that with the baby sand grubbers, if I remember correctly what they're called, and the larvae crawling. In one scene, there were gigantic grubs shown to be, climbing up a rotting log. So obviously there has been reproduction, and obviously the traits of gigantism and most likely also the weird appendages have been transmitted from one generation to the next. This would have to imply that the mutations that were caused by the asteroid chemicals are mutations in the germ line, meaning the non-somatic or non-body cells, meaning the cells that will produce the gametes. Because as you know, the gametes or the sex cells, sperm and egg, are the ones that are responsible for passing on genetic material through the DNA that are found in them. And so we'd have to say that it should be germline mutations that are responsible for passing on these traits in the monsters in the movie. And it's not impossible. There are many such germline mutations, and they can also be caused by extraneous factors like mutagens, chemical mutagens. However, one major wrinkle in the movie in terms of the science is the speed at which the mutations are physically manifested. Mutations normally take some time to become manifested, even in an individual organism. There's no explicit mention of how quickly the traits are manifested, but given how the scenes were shown in the movie, it sort of heavily implied that the results or the manifestations were practically instantaneous. That very shortly after the rain of chemicals on Earth, the insects began to mutate, probably within a few days or a few weeks. And probably the example that shows that most clearly is the story of that goldfish, which just practically suddenly erupted out of its fishbowl and started eating its owner and his dog. I think the name of the character was Todd, if I'm not mistaken. So that's one of the major wrinkles or one of the major questionable elements to the biology. Mutations do not take that fast to become physically manifested, especially mutations that mess with the Hox genes and are passed on from generation to generation and are thus germline mutations. I don't think it's fair to judge whether this is good sci-fi or bad sci-fi, because despite the casual label of it as a sci-fi film because it's based on existing wildlife just taken to an extreme in terms of the size and appearance, I don't think the film really tries to set out to be biologically accurate or scientifically accurate. It's just a tool that it uses, essentially. So it's very, very soft science fiction. And so I wouldn't bother to say that this is bad science fiction. It is a very fun movie, however, and I would recommend it. And if anything, the movie at least serves to make people think of mutations and how mutations actually work. By and large, mutations are usually lethal, meaning they're usually negative and lead to the death of the animal that has incurred the mutation. There are, of course, beneficial mutations, and those are the ingredients for evolution, particularly through natural selection. Now, if you liked what you saw and heard and you would like to see and hear more things that combine science and popular culture, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content. See you again soon!